tonight. It's really hard, I think, for anybody to come on the stage after Jackie Kay announces that poetry is life. But so be it, that's us. I can't think of a person better equipped, actually, than William. Everybody knows William, don't they? So I think introductions are slightly perfunctory, but I will do one anyway to try and make William blush. The thing that should make you blush, William, is that lots of you might have heard William speaking on yesterday, live on, well, not live, but on Radio 4 in the poetry slot. So the Poetry Pharmacy was broadcast as a radio programme yesterday, and there were very many flattering things on Twitter. So I don't recommend you go and search your name on Twitter, because they'll inflate your ego. And a very handsome photo of you in front of a wall.
Well, I'm not sure how handsome it was. It was sort of grabbed because they didn't have one, so I had to. I'd come straight from my sick bed because I fell over a couple of months ago. But anyway.
Yeah. Anyway, I recommend listening to the Poetry Pharmacy. William, as you know, is the founder of National Poetry Day and the Forward Poetry Prize, amongst other things. And he's also, I would say, the sensibility behind the Poetry Pharmacy. It's hard to describe the Poetry Pharmacy as a collection that's been edited. I don't think you're an editor. I think there's a sensibility at work in the collection, and it's a best-selling book, bringing together tried and true prescriptions for the heart, mind, and soul. Someone's called it a dispensary for everyday ills and existential questions. So if you have existential questions, William's the person to talk to. The first volume was published in 2017, and this is the second volume, published last year. In September. Should we start at the beginning? What's the origin story of Poetry Pharmacy? How did it come about?
Well, Rosie was absolutely right. We were at Port Eliot, and Jenny Dyson, who was programming Port Eliot, said to me, "You're always sending me poems to cheer me up when my dad died and when I got divorced. And I want you to come down and bring as many photocopies of poems you can think of that could cheer people up. And I'm going to stick you in a tent with a shrink's couch and an armchair. And I've designed you a prescription pad," which she genuinely had and had it printed. And I thought I'd be there for an hour. And as Rosie said, with a very full bladder late into the evening, I was still there. And then realised that it had to go on the next day, and on it went from there. And then I think somebody who'd been at the festival was a BBC person, and I found myself asked to go on the Reverend Richard Coles's Saturday morning slot, and the producer kept saying, "We've never had so many emails. People were emailing in for prescriptions." So they said, "You better come back at Christmas," because as we know, Christmas can be quite a challenging time en famille. And so I went back, and from there, it went on and on and on. And then I was asked by the government to do a review of the public library network, and I didn't want to be a government inspector visiting libraries. So I offered to do a pharmacy in every library I visited. And that meant that I ended up listening to about 1,000 people's problems over 18 months. And that was the genesis for these books.
Yeah. In the first volume and in this volume, we get more of the backstory about young William and your longing for poetry, the way that poetry functions in your own life. And there's a really charming and delightful story about you sticking up photocopies of a particular poem in a bus window. Do you want to tell us about it?
Well, it's quite interesting. The Forward Prize produces poets, some well-known, and some rather like Top of the Pops that are one-hit wonders. And very early on, there's a poet called Stuart Hanson who had this extraordinary poem called The Price. And when I started National Poetry Day, I blagged £5,000 off the Arts Council to fly post. Little did they know I was going to do this, because of course it turned out it was highly illegal, to fly post poems around cities. And I lived in Oxford Gardens, and the one thing I always knew about Ladbroke Grove is that if you ever get in a bus, you get stuck underneath those bridges. There's no way out of it. So, particularly at second floor level, at double-decker level. And I thought, I'm going to try and use these stops to kind of not disturb people, but to sort of hit people with a poem that might make them think. And so I found this poem by Stuart Hanson from the Forward book, the first year, and I stuck it in Ladbroke Grove. And it goes like this. Sometimes it catches when the fumes rise up among the throbbing lights of cars, or as you look away to dodge eye contact with your own reflection in the carriage glass. Or in a waiting room, a face reminds you that the colour supplements have lied, and some have pleasure, and some pay the price. Then all the small securities you built about your house, your desk, your calendar, are blown like straws, and momentarily, as if a scent of ivy or the earth had opened up a childhood door, you pause to take the measure of what might have been against the kind of life you settled for.
That's amazing, isn't it, that poem? I can just imagine the hurtling bus or someone hurrying somewhere and just coming up short against a hastily pasted photocopy on a window. One of the things I'm really curious about in terms of the collections is the selection process. I want to know the technical stuff. Where do you store the poems? Are you scouring for poems? Are you the sort of person that's covered in Post-it notes? Do you keep scraps under your cap? How do you collect these poems?
Actually, I take photographs of them. I haunt second-hand bookshops, which is a real treat, because let's face it, second-hand bookshops are wonderful. And where I live in Suffolk, there is one of the great second-hand bookshops. And the interesting thing about second-hand bookshops is they're filled with poetry anthologies long since out of print, and quite obscure ones that you will never find anywhere else. And I just find myself, when idle moments, just going through until I find a poem that makes me think, that would be helpful for a particular state of mind, condition, anxiety, or worry.
Are you driven by, we should say that the book is organised with a condition, and there's often there is a reflective prelude by you on the condition and the poem, and then you get the poem. And I wonder if you're driven by the condition, and then you're looking for the prescription, or whether the prescription comes first.
Other way around.
Right?
I start with the poem. And what I've learned, people have said to me for years, over and over again, I'm frightened of poetry. There's something about what we go through at school, and I think it's a failure of teachers and librarians and booksellers and all kinds of people, that people are intimidated by poetry. They often feel, I don't know how to read a poem. But give them a context, give them a sense of understanding or complicity, and suddenly it's all really exciting. Most people look for a poem in a time of need. Somebody's died, someone's getting married, someone's being born. But actually, poems can be really helpful for everything in life. And of course, everything that we experience in life has been written about. So I start with the poem and work back from there.
Is that the case with this second volume? Because I wondered whether in this second collection, if there are particular conditions that have emerged or are somehow articulating something about a particular moment, or your experiences.
Well, I put an email address in the back of the first book and said, rather lazily, let me know if there are any poems you've discovered, in the hope that it might save me a few months at second-hand bookshops if I ever did this again. And I was overwhelmed. I have box files of emails. A lot of incredibly moving tales. People have written, sometimes almost essays about their lives and about the poems that have changed their lives. And so that was the starting point that gave me the courage to go, okay, well, there's room for another book. But also, in my pharmacies, people would go, you haven't got anything for sibling rivalry? Or of course, the other things like, I really hate my mother. And so that got me thinking that this is an unlimited journey, really.
Just out of interest, asking for a friend, what did you prescribe for I hate my mother?
That's a very good question. I'm not entirely sure. I've got quite a lot in this book about parents and their children rather than the other way around. So maybe volume 3. Yeah.
I know the email address to send that query to. Should we get a reading from you on that note?
Yeah. One of the conditions I've chosen in this book is, I thought appropriate actually. This is we'll go straight into parenting. I think we live in an era of pushy parenting. And I understand because I've become a parent myself, and the sort of pressures around you from primary school onwards as a parent about what your children are, you know, what resources they're being given, what extraordinary skills they're supposed to be trained to do in the modern world and everything else. And at the same time, as I've watched the endless pressure of ballet and God knows what else, actually thinking, I want my children to learn how to cook and some more fundamental things. And I found this incredible poem by William Martin, which I thought was very good advice to all you parents out there. It's called, "Do Not Ask Your Children to Strive." Do not ask your children to strive for extraordinary lives. Such striving may seem admirable, but it is the way of foolishness. Help them instead to find the wonder and the marvel of an ordinary life. Show them the joy of tasting tomatoes, apples, and pears. Show them how to cry when pets and people die. Show them the infinite pleasure in the touch of a hand, and make the ordinary come alive for them. The extraordinary will take care of itself.
Yes, that is really wonderful, isn't it? I noticed that the audience paused at the end. And I listening to the programme yesterday, your patients pause too, and you give them time to pause. I wonder if you might talk a little bit more about what a surgery feels and sounds like, what happens in that encounter between you and a patient.
Well, I'm always struck and, as I say, somewhat humbled by the fact that anyone would want or be brave enough to come and pour their heart out to a total stranger. But I'm also struck by the fact that they know they have 15 minutes and or 20 sometimes, but that's the one time we're going to meet and talk. So I feel a responsibility to be utterly present for every second of that time, and to really simply try and ask them what's on their mind, and then really try and let them get a layer deeper underneath. And usually, of course, we end up talking about childhood because that's where so many things originate. And then I try and find the apposite, appropriate poem that gives them a sense of complicity with how they feel. Because if you find that complicity, that sense of being understood, as Alan Bennett put it, it's as though somebody has reached out a hand to you. And if that expression of your anxiety, expressed considerably, probably more beautifully than you could express yourself, resonates, you're not alone and you're understood. You're not mad. And what's more, if it was written 700 years ago, we've all been going through this forever, and it normalizes it. And a shrink said to me the other day, "I'm so jealous." And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, you're giving a sort of CBT of poetry for people. And they can get up and, in some ways, with this recognition, hopefully move on. My lot are coming back on Thursday to say the same old thing."
Are there poems, have there been patients, stories for which you have not been able to find a poem? Or do you have absolute faith in poetry in these situations?
Actually, the most shocking... No, not the one of the most shocking. Actually, not even the most shocking. But one of the most shocking was at Port Eliot when I started with Rosie. A woman came to see me, and she said, "Like the Lion in the Wizard of Oz, I've lost my courage." And she said, "I'm a brave person, but I'm a solo transatlantic sailor, and I've sailed across the Atlantic 3 times on my own, but I'm being stalked. And I'm being stalked by a man who moves around Europe, and no domestic police force in any one of those countries is prepared to pursue him." And then she showed me an email that she'd received from the editor of the main yachting magazine in Germany asking to do a profile. And then she showed me how it was actually a fraud, and the stalker had created it and tracked her down to try and get her. And she said, "I've looked up this psychological type, and 95% of them end up in the stalker killing their victim." And I have to say, I was utterly at a loss.
I can imagine that would be very, very difficult indeed. Your sensibility was the term I used earlier. Your sensibility emanates from both the selection of the poems, but also your reflections, your meditations on the conditions of being lonely, of mourning the dead, of parenting, of falling in love or falling out of love. They're all personal meditations too. And I wonder how far this collection is not just about the patients, but about the doctor as well.
Well, again, I think I'm driven by an urge to open the doors to poetry to people. And perhaps by bringing the personal in, it makes it easier for people to connect and engage. I do think poetry, as I said, the P word is frightening for people. It's a dusty back of a bookshop, slim volume elite thing, and often in their minds. And yet, somehow or other, the country is filled with poetry and jingles and greetings cards and sung on football terraces and William Blake at Twickenham and all this kind of stuff. And actually, I just want to get rid of people's fear of poetry. And I think one of the best ways of doing that is, as I say, to humanize it.
Yeah. Should we get another reading in? This one might be for me, to my husband's alarm, Love Growing Stale. Have to keep them on their toes, right? So he'll be listening to this podcast.
I love this. This will resonate with everybody in the room. This was written by Rumi, who you probably know wrote a very, very long time ago. And it's called Here is a Relationship Booster. Here is a relationship booster that is guaranteed to work. Every time your spouse or lover says something stupid, make your eyes light up as if you just heard something brilliant.
I think that's the best advice. And maybe you'll put it into practice. Just one last question. If there is one poem, maybe it's that one, that will aid us all, which one would it be? Or one poet?
Well, Mary Oliver, who died last year, and if you don't know Mary Oliver's work, go out and buy her work, because she was really the most remarkable woman. And this is my poem to end 2019, which quite frankly was a shocking year all round for all of us. And it's called Don't Hesitate. If you suddenly and unexpectedly feel joy, don't hesitate. Give in to it. There are plenty of lives and whole towns destroyed or about to be. We are not wise and not very often kind, and much can never be redeemed. Still, life has some possibility left. Perhaps this is its way of fighting back, that sometimes something happens better than all the riches or power in the world. It could be anything, but very likely you notice it in the instant when love begins. Anyway, that's often the case. Anyway, whatever it is, don't be afraid of its plenty. Joy is not made to be a crumb.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking William Sieghart.